All right, everybody, welcome back to the show. Today, we're diving into a topic that's been causing a lot of discussion, speculation, and frankly, a lot of confusion in the peptide and performance medicine community. Recently, one of the largest research peptide companies in the world, Peptide Sciences, announced that they were immediately shutting down operations and discontinuing the sale of all research products. Now, for people who have followed the peptide space over the last decade, this is a pretty big moment. And it raises a much bigger question. Why is this happening now? And more importantly, is this just the first domino to fall? Today, we're going to break down step by step because once you understand how medications are actually distributed and regulated in the United States, the situation becomes a lot clearer. So, let's start at the top. Most people think that there's only one way medications reach patients. You go to the pharmacy, you pick up a prescription, and that's the end of the story. But in reality, there are three very different systems operating simultaneously. And understanding these three systems explains almost everything about what's happening right now. The first system is what everyone is familiar with, traditional retail pharmacies. Think Walgreens, think CVS. These pharmacies dispense medications that are manufactured by large pharmaceutical companies and approved through the FDA drug approval process. Before these drugs ever reach a pharmacy shelf, they go through years and years of clinical trials and regulatory review. But there's another important layer here that often gets overlooked. The pharmaceutical industry is one of the most powerful lobbying forces in the United States. Large pharmaceutical companies invest billions of dollars into research and development, but they also invest heavily in political influence and lobbying efforts that shape healthcare policy and regulatory frameworks. Agencies like the FDA exist to protect public health, but they also operate within a political and economic ecosystem where pharmaceutical companies have enormous influence. And that influence matters because it helps determine which therapies ultimately reach the patients. Now, let's move on to the second system, compounding pharmacies. Now, compounding pharmacies operate very differently from traditional pharmaceutical manufacturers. Instead of mass-producing medications, compounding pharmacies prepare customized medications for individual patients based on a prescription from a licensed medical practitioner. These pharmacies primarily operate within the United States and are regulated at the state level through boards of pharmacy. They follow strict quality and sterility standards and must meet regulatory requirements that are heavily focused on patient safety. One key difference is that compounding pharmacies don't manufacture drugs for mass distribution. They create medications for specific patients with specific prescriptions. The FDA can issue guidance, keyword guidance, related to compounding pharmacy practices and pharmacies, but historically, the oversight of compounding pharmacies has largely been handled by state pharmacy boards, not the FDA. And importantly, every medication produced by a compounding pharmacy requires a valid prescription, period. A medical practitioner is always involved, which brings us to the third system, the underground. And this is where things start to get a little complicated. So over the past decade, a completely different marketplace has emerged, research chemical companies. These companies sell substances labeled strictly for laboratory research purposes. Every product is required to be labeled for research purpose only or for research use only and not for human consumption. These companies are not really pharmacies. They're not providing medical care at all. There are no prescriptions involved with these at all. There is no medical practitioner required to participate in the process whatsoever. Research chemical companies, they exist all over the world. Many of them purchase bulk chemicals from overseas suppliers, repackage those substances with different labels, and just sell them online at a significant markup. In theory, these products are intended for laboratory research. But in actual practice, we know that's not true. A very different reality begins to emerge. Over time, individuals began purchasing these chemicals with the intention of using them not for research, but medically to treat themselves. And in some cases, even medical practitioners began purchasing research chemicals in bulk, thinking they could make a little extra money and dispensing them to patients. That is explicitly illegal because the entire regulatory structure designed to protect patients is just being bypassed. There's no prescription oversight, no pharmaceutical quality control, no verified manufacturing standards, no clinical regulatory pathway. At that point, regulators are no longer looking at a research marketplace. They are looking at a full-blown, unregulated medical supply chain. And that's when enforcement starts to happen. Which brings us back to the recent shutdown of Peptide Sciences. So Peptide Sciences was one of the largest companies operating in the research peptide marketplace. But the key issue regulators are likely focused on is something we like to call intent. If chemicals labeled as research only are consistently being purchased, used, and marketed for medical purposes, the argument that they are purely research tools becomes very difficult to maintain. And once regulators believe that the intended use is medical, enforcement actions, they're just going to be inevitable. In my opinion, this moment has been coming for a long, long time. When research chemical companies started appearing roughly 10 years ago, it was only a matter of time before regulators stepped in. Peptide Sciences may be the largest company affected so far, but they will almost certainly not be the last. And there is another strategy being used to accelerate this process: financial pressure. Regulators and industry groups have increasingly pressured credit card processors and payment networks to restrict services to research chemical vendors. Without payment processing, it becomes extremely difficult for these businesses to even operate. And that pressure alone can shut down an entire industry, believe me. Now, let's talk about something that has caused a lot of confusion within the peptide community: the FDA's categorization system for substances used in compounding. Many people have heard about peptides like BPC 157 or CJC 1295 being placed into something called Category 2 by the FDA. To understand what that means, we need to look at an FDA guidance document titled The Interim Policy on Compounding Using Bulk Drug Substances under Section 503A of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. This document describes how exactly the FDA organizes substances that have been nominated for potential inclusion into compounding. Now, just to be clear, this is a document, a memo, so to speak, an internal memo, just for those working at the FDA to give them some guidance and understanding as to how they should schedule things and work through things. And importantly, the FDA states clearly that guidance documents do not establish legally enforceable responsibilities. They sound big and bad and important, but they are just guidance. They represent the agency's current thinking and serve as recommendations under a specific law or regulation that is being cited. That was taken straight from the FDA website. Within the document, substances are placed into 3 different categories. Category 1 includes substances currently under evaluation that appear to have sufficient supporting information. Okay, so those are good. Category 2 includes substances where the FDA believes there may be potential safety concerns or may not be potential safety concerns requiring further evaluation. Okay, that sounds a little gray. Category 3 includes substances that were not nominated for inclusion but do not include enough information for the FDA to evaluate. The challenge is the criteria, particularly for Category 2, can be extremely subjective. Category 2 essentially represents a gray zone where the agency believes there may be risks, but does not yet have enough information to make a definitive determination. So there's really no boundaries on that category 2. You can say there's not enough information and just ignore the countless research studies that have shown that there's plenty of information there. If you're being pressured by a lobbying group to go one way or another, yeah, you can look the other way and stick it in category 2, it'll just stay there in purgatory forever. For example, one explanation provided for BPC 157 references potential immunogenicity concerns, whatever that means, and limited safety information for certain routes of information. But in the same explanation, the FDA acknowledges a lack of sufficient information to determine whether the substance would actually cause any harm at all. To many people following peptide research, that reasoning just raises more questions than answers, because BPC 157 has been studied in both animal and human research settings for years, and it's a peptide naturally occurring within the body. And this leads me to an even broader issue. Naturally occurring peptides are extremely difficult to patent. And if a therapy, a medication, a pharmaceutical cannot be first patented and then monopolized, it becomes far less attractive within the traditional pharmaceutical business model. Large pharmaceutical companies invest enormous resources into developing drugs that first have to be patented and then commercialized. When therapies fall outside that model, the regulatory and economic dynamics surrounding them become far more complicated, and that tension can place pressure on both legitimate compounding pharmacies and research chemical companies for very different reasons. So where does this leave the patients and the clinicians? The most important takeaway is this. For the love of God, please, please, please work with a qualified medical practitioner who understands the regulatory landscape and who can provide medications intended and approved for human use. I can't believe I have to say that out loud. Make sure that the medication you are taking, if you are a human, is designed for humans. How about that? Next up, ask questions. Ask questions. You have to be your own advocate. Understand where your medications come from and make sure they are being produced and dispensed through legitimate medical channels. Because ultimately, protecting your health requires doing your own due diligence. And as the peptide industry continues to evolve, this conversation is only getting started. So I hope you guys enjoyed the content. If you like this and others, please like and subscribe. Hit me up in the comments if you have any questions or concerns. And who knows, maybe your comment is going to be the next one that I geek out on. So we'll see you in the next episode. Until then, stay healthy.